We're here with Linda Teague, a native of Salinas, who has graciously agreed to tell us her stories about her family and about the Teague name and their life in Salinas and her own journeys in Salinas and the world. It's April 27th, 2014, about 11 a.m., and we're off.
Okay, I'm going to be talking today about my father's side of the family, the Teagues, which is also my maiden name. The family came here originally. The story has been told to me that it was two brothers, and they were Scots-Irish, and they came out of Northern Ireland, along with a lot of other people, and came over as indentured servants, which is a form of slavery, yes, but at least you are given room and board and you are paid for the work you do. It's on a contract. It happens that in my family it was for 20 years. And they came into probably, I would say, the port of New Orleans and ended up in Ogilvie, Georgia, which is where the person who held their contract lived. They worked there until their contract was finished, and then they moved further west and north into Washington County, Arkansas. And that's where my family is from. It's northwest Arkansas. It's where, around the city of Fayetteville, which is where the University of Arkansas is. And my mother's family is also from there, and I want to talk a little bit about that. One of the things that's always fascinated me about my family is that only one side of my family came out to California. And there's a very good reason for that. The side of the family that came here, the Teagues, were sharecroppers. They never owned land, and they worked from place to place. My Granny Teague, when she would talk about her past, would say things like, well, when we were up at the old Parker place, or when we were out at the Woodwards, her life was divided up by whoever the landowners were that they were currently sharecropping for. And I found that quite significant. My mother's family didn't come here, and for reasons just exactly the opposite of how the Teagues came here. They owned a bit of land, and they were able to keep their land even during the Depression, and even with a tremendous amount of children and bad times. And my mother talks a lot about eating more than her fair share of squirrel pie, but they at least never had to leave their home from hunger and from lack of work. But the Teagues did, and that's who I'm going to talk about today. My family actually came out to California twice. This is kind of interesting. When they came out originally, I've figured out that it's about 1936. And at that time, my father was 17 years old. And he had gone into the Civilian Conservation Corps, which you could go into at the age of 16. And he spent a lot of time planting trees in Utah, or so the story goes. And so he wasn't initially on that first trip out here. But all of his other siblings, his four other siblings, were, because they were all underage at that point. And they ended up here. They lived in Alisal renting, and then eventually were able to buy a house. My grandparents were farm workers and worked in the sheds and in the fields. My grandfather, Bill Teague, died young. 1958, I think he was not much more than about 60 or 62 years old, something like that. But my grandmother lived quite a long time. In her later years, after she was widowed, she worked at the bag factory out on the highway between Salinas and Castroville, sewing bags that they put onions and potatoes in around here. Maybe it was just onions, I'm not sure. Anyway, she was a bit of a seamstress, and she did that as her job until she was 65. She never learned to drive. We had to take her everywhere. As far as I know, they never went back to Arkansas and visited my grandparents. which I'm not quite sure why. I find it a little bit odd. I know that some of the rest of the family on my grandmother's side, my grandmother was a Sizemore. Her name was Sizemore. They went up and worked also in produce, but they worked in the cherries up in Yakima, Washington. So I had a whole other branch of the family up there also working in agriculture. And we visited them a couple of times up there. When I was growing up, we lived at 144 Williams Road in Alisal. I spent my whole life in Salinas until I left to go to college in Alisal. And it was a very mixed community at that time. I would say it was about not even half Mexican American, and the rest were Okies and Arkies, and a smattering of Filipinos, Japanese, and Chinese. I think I never met a black person until I was in high school, and then I only met one that was half black and half Japanese. So that was kind of odd. And I'm sorry, I'm leaving out one important part. So when my father, after the Civilian Conservation Corps, he went into the Army. When he went into the Army, he went back to Arkansas instead of coming out here to where his family was. And he met my mother. My mother was the postmistress of Elkins, Arkansas, a war widow with a small girl. And they married, and they had me and my sister Kim back there. So I'm actually not born here. They immigrated out here, and so I can say my family came out here twice, as I said before, in 1956 when I was 3 years old. So that's how I got to Salinas and to Alisal. I did all of my elementary school at Fremont Elementary School, and it was the most wonderful experience. I loved school from the minute I was in it. I was always very good at it, and I got a lot of help from my teachers and also the principals and vice principals. I can't say enough, honestly. And a big shout out to Miss Palmtag, my second grade teacher, and Mrs. Warren, my third grade teacher. Oh, they just meant the world to me. And Mrs. Presley, my fourth grade teacher, who made the decision that really quite changed my life from then on. She decided that I would be a good candidate for Accelerated Fifth, which is, I think, a program they don't do anymore, but I'm not sure. And I was bused from Fremont over to Sanborn Elementary School for Accelerated Fifth Grade, where they took all of the, I guess, like best and brightest of fifth graders in Alisal and put them all together in one class. And we spent a whole year together, and then some of us went on and did Accelerated Sixth Grade. And I did that as well. That was back at Fremont Elementary School. I was introduced to lots of things that weren't in the usual curriculum. It was a mind-broadening experience. We did anthropology. We did 2 languages. We did not only Spanish, which was kind of de rigueur for everybody in the district, but also French. So I was able to start learning French when I was in 5th grade. And I studied it actually all the way into college until I was a sophomore in college. Anyway, I can't say enough about that experience. I went on to El Sacel. I think it's called middle school now, but when I was going to school there, it was junior high. And also another wonderful experience. Had an opportunity to work in journalism, found out that I was kind of a natural born writer. And I was encouraged just wonderfully by teachers and everybody to continue that. And I did. And when I went into high school, there was a bit of a flub up because I had been doing these kind of advanced classes. For some reason, that didn't get translated very well over to the high school, and I was originally put in just, and I don't want to say this in a derogatory way, but in the average classes. And I can remember so clearly the day I marched into the vice principal's office at Alisal High School, and I said, "You've made a mistake. I'm supposed to be in the XYZ classes. And if you look at my transcripts and you look at the work that I've done in my grades, you'll see that that's so." And they did, and I was moved. And I spent the rest of my high school years in the XYZ classes, which were the top classes. There was nothing like, what do they call them now? Advanced placement, I think, AP classes in high school. They didn't have anything like that then. So I guess it was more or less the equivalent of that. Again, I had people that just encouraged the heck out of me while I was there. And I was able to take classes that were a little bit out of the norm there as well, for people that were in the more advanced classes. And I want to send a huge shout out to Ann Garbarini, who was my American history teacher in 10th grade. And there's quite a tale to be told there. I won't go into it in a great deal of detail, but it ended up that she saw something in me, a spark of some kind, and her family ended up, unbeknownst to me, paying for a great deal of my college education. And I didn't find out about it until years later that was so. It's just an amazing thing that somebody would take a shine to you or see a spark in you and know that you would benefit from a higher education and to actually make sure that you were in a position to do it. My father owned a cabinet shop for many, many years on 515 East Alisal Street in Alisal. It's called P&T Cabinets. And I think mostly because he didn't have access to a good education himself. He was a good craftsman, and he had really good craftsmen working for him at the shop, but he was not a very good businessman. And so we struggled a lot, and there were 5 children in my family. And we lived, after Williams Road, we moved when I was in first grade to 1439 First Avenue in Salinas. And that's where I lived until I was 18 and went away to college. It was a small house. You can imagine 7 people living in basically like a 3-bedroom house with 1 bathroom and a kind of a half bath, but not really. It was pretty tough. But we all thrived. And especially academically, that really runs through my family. And I want to send a shout out to also, I'm sorry, but when you give somebody an education and when you encourage people to have an education, that's a gift that keeps on giving, not only for yourself, but also for your family. And I'm very proud to say that I have college graduates in my family that from MIT, from Caltech, from Oberlin, from just tremendous universities across the United States. I myself have an undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley, and I have a master's degree from San Francisco State. Nobody in my family on the Teague side, the family we're talking about now that settled here in Salinas, had ever gone to college. And a lot of them never even finished high school. So you don't realize you're blazing a path when you're working at it. You just kind of know, oh, I really like this and I want to do this, and you just keep plowing forward, plowing forward. I can say quite honestly, I didn't have a lot of support of emotionally, psychologically, and definitely not financially. My family had absolutely no money. And I worked in the fields, as did all my siblings when we were kids. I picked strawberries, I hoed lettuce, I worked in the sheds. One summer I picked out the strange-looking carrots that came down the conveyor belt so that those didn't end up in the sack. Another time I worked on the line that did the broccoli, where you place the broccoli in the trough and you put the wire around it, and then you step on a pedal and it comes up and cuts the ends off of it so it's very even, and then you throw that back on the line and it eventually ends up in your supermarket. I did that one summer as well, and I continued to work in the produce in the summer until I was a junior in college. The money was very good, and it was a way to make money to help me live during my college years. Okay, now I'm kind of stuck. Where should I go from here?
Well, I have a couple questions.
Please.
Did you have any more you wanted to say about your I know Catherine Olin calls her your Granny Teague. Any of her stories?
Yes, I do. I surely do. Besides the fact that they never owned their own land and that they were dependent so much upon the temperament and largesse of whoever they were sharecropping for, as time went on, and especially as the Depression went on, and I'm sure this was a huge impetus for getting them out of Arkansas, people really started to cut corners. One of the stories I remember, because my grandmother was the woman in the family and the wife of the male sharecropper, she was in charge of laundry for the big house, and I'm sure laundry of her own family as well. And she was paid by the piece. And she said that one place that they worked started sewing some of the pieces together. Like they would sew like 3 or 4 towels together and call it one piece. And other things too that could easily, I think probably they didn't try to do it with blouses or pants or something, but something that was square, handkerchiefs, things like that. They would try to cut corners so that my grandmother and our family would not be paid. And she would just rip them to pieces. She would rip them apart, not rip them to pieces. She would rip them apart, wash them, and send them on and charge them for all of them. So there was that kind of pettiness that went on, and maybe that's not the right word, because even people that owned land that were living in the South in the Depression were hard off. They were. And the part of Arkansas that they were from, though it was not touched hardly at all by dust storms, was still one of the poorest states in the nation. It still is, Arkansas. And it was just real tough for everybody. But you can imagine how scary it would have been. I didn't realize this as a kid. As an adult, you realize how scary it was for my family to not know if they would have a job, if they would have a place to sleep, and that anybody could dismiss them summarily for no reason. There certainly was no kind of union for sharecroppers. There were hardly any unions at all for anything at that time, and especially in the South, and that's still true today. So it was very tough going, very tough going. Maybe that's why they never went back. It was such bad memories of not being treated very well. I don't actually know. I was never old enough to understand what that meant in time to ask the question.
So did they stay, they were given places to
Yes,
live in?
sharecropping worked along these lines. You were given a place to stay, although I have seen, I don't think this happened to my family, but I have seen where sometimes it was just tents that were set up. But in an outbuilding of some kind, probably, I mean, I don't really know, but I imagine some of them were like old chicken coops that kind of got a bit refurbished, maybe, you hope. And They would have their own little garden nearby, and my grandmother and my parents also, we always had a garden here in Salinas. I think they always wanted to know that if anything happened, they at least had food for a few days out in the garden. I'm sure that's true. So we always had a bit of a garden. My mother called it a kitchen garden, because usually it was right outside the kitchen door. I think that's why. So I grew up eating really fresh foods all the time. We bought almost nothing from the market except bread. My mother didn't make bread. But everything else pretty much. And my father hunted, as did my grandfather. As you probably know, there's lots of wild boar here in Monterey County. They're quite the nuisance. I've eaten a lot of them. My father would go hunting and catch wild boar, and because my grandmother had grown up, as did almost everybody who lived on a farm, slaughtering a pig in the fall, and she knew exactly how to do that, and she would, as we called it, dress the hog, which basically means to, get its skin and entrails off of it and cut it up into pieces, and we would share it in our family. As I said, my father had 4 other siblings who lived here in town, so I have quite a few first cousins still living here in town, and 2 of my siblings still live in Monterey County, although not in Salinas. So we ate that, and my father fished a lot too, so most of our protein came from what my father hunted and fished. So I grew up eating a lot of bass and catfish, and sausage and pork roast made out of wild boar.
Where did he go fishing?
He fished, I'll tell a story on him now that he's dead and gone. He fished illegally a lot, but he kind of made peace. He liked to fish down near Fort Hunter Liggett, down in southern Monterey County. Apparently it was good fishing down there. And he kind of made peace with the Army guys there. They knew who he was. My dad's name was Teague, and it was kind of like, it's just Guy, let him through, because he's going to find his way in anyway. So he fished there a lot. He also fished up in Arroyo Seco, which a lot of other people did too around here, which is quite a bit closer. We didn't go with him very often. Oh, we also went to Lake Nacimiento and fished there. Oh, and every year we would go up to the Yuba River for my father to fish, but also because my mother, one of her sisters, lived there. And that's a whole other story, but those guys all worked for Del Monte and worked in the fruit. My whole family is nothing but things that come out of the ground. Cherries up in Washington, all different kinds of fruit up around the Sacramento Yuba area, and then the farm here in Salinas for the family that was here.
Well, also, I'm curious, since you were such a scholar, did you have time for fun when you went to high school?
Yeah, I feel like I did. We did, didn't we, Kathy? We did. We had a good time. We had a championship basketball team all 4 years that I was in high school. We always made at least the regional finals, didn't we? Mm-hmm. And so we would go to every game. We would go to all the ones that were at the gym at Alisal High, because I went to Alisal High. Class of 71. Woohoo! And we also would go to the away games, and I was on the buses on like Friday and Saturday night. They would have like sometimes even 2 or 3 buses full of students from the high school because we supported that team. I also went to all the football games. So a lot of it was like that, school-related things, but fun.
And you felt really comfortable in the Alisal High School?
Oh yes, I did. One of the things that I want to talk about, besides the fact that I got a superior education, is that, again, when you grow up in a place that's multicultural, like this town at least was at the time when I was growing up here, and especially out in Alisal, harsh things were predicted for that high school when it was built. It opened, I believe, the first class came in '66. Am I right? '65? I came in, what would it be, 68. So it was quite a new school when I was there. But I think that they thought, because also concurrently there were a lot of things happening socially in Salinas. Farm Workers Union, of which I was a member for a while, by the way. I've belonged to the Farm Workers Union, the Teamsters, and the AFL-CIO, working in the fields and the sheds in Salinas. I still have my cards. Very proud. But they thought perhaps we might have riots, and that there would be, because there was a preponderance of Mexican Americans and there was a lot of fomenting of anger of the situation. I can clearly remember when I was a child on Alisal and Market Streets, where we had bracero parks, where people came in and set up just hundreds of tents and cooked out on open fires. It's a very strong memory of my childhood. Late 50s,
And where?
early 60s.
Where were the towns?
One of them was down just north of Montymart, kind of catty corner from El Sisal junior high school. That whole field there, which is now, I think, apartments and condominiums, used to be a really large bracero park.
And tents.
Tents, yeah.
And how about?
I'm not sure what they did. I'm not sure. We didn't go in there. It wasn't something that we did, although a lot of the bracero kids would come in and go to school. And a lot of them went to my elementary school because that was the nearest one to the bracero park. So we would sometimes see kids only for a few months at a time, and then their parents would move on to other places. And hopefully they were able to continue their education as they went. What I really want to stress about all of this is that we did not feel a racial inequality that much. I don't want to speak for the Mexican Americans that were in my class, but everything was done on a meritocracy as far as I can tell. All of my classes were mixed race, and I, as I said, was in advanced classes. Our student body president, when I was a senior in high school, was a Mexican American. That would have been in 1971. We were all friends. I know it sounds kind of odd. I can remember feeling really uncomfortable when I went to other places, when I started doing my education, etc., and there would just be all white people. It made me very nervous. I didn't like it because I had not grown up like that. I had always grown up with a big mix of Mexican Americans and assorted Asians. And we had always been really tight friends. In particular, I had a lot of Filipino friends. As you know, there's a huge Filipino community here in Salinas, and I'm sure there still is. Big shout out to the Albano family. And we spent time in their homes. The Shababas also on First Avenue, they lived just down the street from us. Very eye-opening to go into these homes. They had odd kitchen utensils that they used to make odd dishes that we didn't eat, but were curious about. It was just wonderful. And again, because you're so young and you're doing this, you don't realize how special it is and unique in many ways. I understand now that Alisal is darn near getting close up to like 99% Mexican American, and that so many of the old families that originally came out of the South, or I guess also maybe the Asians too, I don't know, the Filipinos, the Japanese, the Chinese that were in my high school and in school all along, don't live there anymore. And it makes me really sad because it was a marvelous place to grow up. marvelous. I know a lot of people say this, but we never locked our front door, ever. Our door was always open. Everybody's door was always open. I mean, you would knock if you went to somebody's house, but the door was never locked. And I have a feeling that maybe Alice Al isn't quite like that now. I'm just I have terribly fond memories and a big glow in my heart for having grown up there.